There's a moment that doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself with chaos or clarity. It slips in quietly, almost like a thought you weren't expecting. You're sitting alone, or maybe just distracted enough, and something feels off. Not wrong, not dramatic, just unfamiliar. You start noticing that some of your thoughts don't feel like they belong to you. Not in a paranoid way, but in a subtle, unsettling sense, as if certain ideas were placed there long before you ever questioned them. The way you judge yourself, the way you compare your life to others, the silent rules you follow without ever remembering who taught them to you. You didn't choose most of that, and deep down, you know it. From a very early age, your mind began collecting patterns, voices, reactions, expectations, parents, teachers, society, culture, all leaving small imprints. None of it felt invasive at the time. It felt normal. It felt like learning. But learning doesn't always mean understanding. Sometimes it just means absorbing. And when you absorb without questioning, those patterns become invisible. They stop feeling like external influences and start feeling like identity. That's where things get complicated, because once something feels like you stop examining it. You defend it. You build your life around it, even if it's limiting you, even if it's not truly yours. Think about how many times you've held yourself back without knowing why. How often you've doubted your own decisions. How frequently your inner voice sounds more critical than supportive. Where did that voice come from? Was it always yours? Or was it shaped by years of repetition, reinforced by moments you barely remember? This isn't about blaming the past. It's about recognizing how deeply it still lives inside you. Because the moment you begin to notice these patterns, something shifts. You start creating distance. And in that distance, for the first time, you get a glimpse of something real. Not the version of you that was built over time, but the one that was always there, underneath everything. And once you see that, even briefly, it becomes impossible to ignore. At first, the realization doesn't feel empowering. It feels destabilizing. Because if many of your thoughts were shaped by external influences, then what exactly is left that is truly yours? That question can be uncomfortable, not because there's no answer, but because the answer requires you to slow down and observe something most people avoid, your own mind in real time. You begin to notice how automatic everything is. A situation happens, and before you even process it, your mind reacts. It labels, judges, predicts outcomes, and often assumes the worst. Not because it's accurate, but because it's familiar. Familiarity feels like truth, but it isn't always. The brain is designed to repeat what it already knows. It prefers efficiency over accuracy, so instead of questioning every thought, it recycles old ones, even if they don't serve you anymore. That's why certain fears feel so convincing. That's why self-doubt can sound like logic. And that's why breaking out of these patterns feels so difficult. You're not just changing behavior. You're interrupting something that has been running automatically for years. But here's the part most people don't realize. The moment you observe a thought instead of immediately believing it, you've already changed something fundamental. You've created a gap. And inside that gap, there's freedom. Not complete freedom, not instant transformation, but enough space to question. Enough space to ask, is this actually true? Most people never reach that point. They live their entire lives reacting to thoughts they never chose, following internal narratives they never examined. And because of that, everything feels fixed. But it's not. The patterns may be strong, but they're not permanent. They were learned, which means they can be unlearned, slowly, subtly, without force. It starts with awareness, not control. Because trying to control your mind too quickly often backfires. It creates resistance, frustration, even more noise. But observing it? That's different. Observation doesn't fight the mind, it reveals it. And once something is revealed, it loses part of its power. That's where real change begins. Not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in quiet moments where you stop, notice, and realize, this thought doesn't have to define me. There's a strange shift that happens once you start questioning your thoughts. Things that once felt solid begin to feel flexible. Reactions that used to be instant now slow down, just enough for you to see them forming. And in that brief moment, you start to recognize something important. You are not your first reaction. That initial voice in your head, the one that criticizes, doubts, or assumes, is often just a pattern replaying itself. It's fast, automatic, and familiar. But it's not final. What comes after that first reaction is where something real begins to appear, a second voice, quieter, less urgent, but more intentional. This is the part most people overlook, because it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention. It simply waits. And if you're not paying attention, you miss it. But once you start noticing it, everything changes. Because now, instead of being pulled instantly into old patterns, you have a choice. Not a perfect choice, not an easy one, but a real one. You can follow the old thought, or you can pause. That pause might only last a few seconds, but it's enough. Enough to question, enough to redirect, enough to respond differently. And over time, those small pauses start to accumulate. They create space between who you were conditioned to be and who you're becoming. This process isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like a breakthrough. In fact, it often feels subtle, almost invisible. But that's exactly why it works. Because real change rarely announces itself. It builds quietly, moment by moment, choice by choice. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to notice something new. You feel less controlled by your own mind, less reactive, less trapped in the same cycles. Not because the thoughts disappeared, but because your relationship with them changed. You stopped treating them as commands and started seeing them as suggestions. That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. Because once you stop obeying every thought, you start discovering something deeper than thought itself. A sense of presence. A kind of clarity that doesn't come from thinking more, but from identifying less. And in that clarity, for the first time, you begin to feel what it's like to actually be in control, not of everything, but of what truly matters. As this awareness grows, something unexpected begins to happen. You start seeing the same patterns not only in yourself, but in other people. Conversations feel different. Reactions become more predictable. You begin to notice how often people speak from scripts they didn't realize they were following. The same fears, the same judgments, the same repeated beliefs. It's not because people lack depth. It's because most people never pause long enough to question what's happening inside them. They react, just like you used to, and in a way still do sometimes, because this isn't about reaching some perfect state where you're completely free from conditioning. That doesn't exist. This is about becoming aware of it, and choosing more often than not to be controlled by it. But here's where it gets complicated. The more aware you become, the more alone you might feel. Not because you're actually alone, but because you're no longer engaging with the world in the same automatic way. You don't react as quickly. You don't get pulled into the same emotional patterns. You start questioning things that others accept without hesitation. And that can create distance. Not intentionally, but naturally. Because awareness changes how you relate to everything. It changes what you tolerate, what you believe, what you pursue. And sometimes that shift isn't comfortable, but it is necessary, because staying unconscious is easier. It's simpler to follow familiar patterns, even if they lead nowhere. But once you've seen beyond them even briefly, it's hard to go back. You can't unsee it. You can't pretend you don't notice. And that's where real growth begins, not in comfort, but in honesty. Honesty with yourself about what you've been repeating, what you've been avoiding, and what you've been accepting without question. That honesty isn't always pleasant, but it's real. And in a world where most things are filtered, rushed, and automatic, real is rare. So if you've started to notice these patterns, even slightly, that's not something to ignore. That's the beginning of something deeper, something most people never allow themselves to experience. There's a point in this process where things begin to stabilize, not because everything is suddenly clear, but because you stop expecting clarity to come all at once. You start understanding that your mind isn't something to conquer, it's something to understand. And that changes your approach completely. Instead of trying to silence your thoughts, you begin to listen to them differently. You notice patterns without immediately reacting to them. You recognize emotional triggers without letting them dictate your behavior. And slowly, a new kind of relationship forms, not one based on control, but on awareness. This is where a subtle kind of confidence starts to emerge. Not loud confidence, not the kind that needs validation, but a quiet certainty. The kind that comes from knowing you don't have to believe everything you think. That alone changes how you move through the world. Situations that once overwhelmed you now feel more manageable, not because they changed, but because your internal response did. And that's the part most people underestimate. External circumstances matter, but your interpretation of them matters more. Two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different realities, not because the situation was different, but because their minds processed it differently. Once you understand that, you stop looking for control outside. You stop waiting for the perfect conditions, and you start working with what's already happening inside you. That's where real power is, not in controlling everything around you, but in understanding what's happening within you, and choosing, as often as you can, not to be driven by unconscious patterns. This doesn't mean you'll never struggle. You will. It doesn't mean you'll never fall back into old habits. You will. But now you'll notice it faster. And that makes all the difference, because awareness shortens the distance between reaction and correction. It allows you to return to yourself quicker. And over time, that consistency builds something solid, not perfection, but direction. And direction, when it's aligned with awareness, leads somewhere real. At some point, the question shifts. It's no longer, why do I think this way? It becomes, what do I want to do with this awareness? Because seeing the patterns is only the beginning. What you do with that insight is what actually shapes your life. You can ignore it and fall back into automatic habits, or you can start making small, deliberate changes, nothing extreme, nothing forced, just small shifts in how you respond, how you speak to yourself, how you interpret what happens around you. Those small shifts matter more than they seem, because they compound quietly over time, and eventually they create a version of you that feels more real. Not perfect, not finished, but more aligned, more intentional, more present. And maybe that's the point. Not to become someone completely different, but to remove what was never truly yours to begin with, to stop carrying beliefs, fears, and expectations that were placed on you without your awareness, and to slowly return to something simpler, something clearer, something that doesn't need constant validation to exist. That process doesn't have an endpoint, it's ongoing. But once it starts, it changes how you see everything, including yourself. And if you've made it this far, if you've followed this idea all the way through, then you've already done something most people don't. You've paused, you've reflected, you've questioned something deeper, and that alone puts you in a different place. So now the only real question left is, what are you going to do with it?